Good morning, everyone. Today, in our first very proud sessions, the title is Defending the Defenders, Solutions for a Safer World for Human Rights Advocates. And the speakers are Umar Khan, Senior Human Rights Advisor, UN President Coordinator's Office, Bangladesh. Rani Yanyan, Advisor of the Chakma Circle Chief, Bangladesh. Shanti Maria D'Souza, Pangal, Montraya Institute for Strategic Studies, India. And moderator is Apon Johid, Senior Research Associate, CBS. Now, I'm asking our honorable speakers and moderators to take their designated seat. Well, Mr. Moderators, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. One of the first parallel sessions that are going on at the Bay of Bengal Conversation 2024. If you have been part of the rest of the conversation, I hope you have enjoyed. Today, we have a very distinguished panel with us, and the topic is, of course, human rights and human rights defenders. So, human rights is one of the oldest aspirations for human society. And over the millennia, it has been an expression of progress for human society as well. Wherever there is progress, we expect there to be better condition for human rights as well. We see many historic moments that have either given rise to human rights or human rights leading to those historic, or the struggle for human rights leading to those historic moments. Some of the oldest laws in human society, such as the Ten Commandments, the Bible, the Quran, even going back to the Code of Hammurabi. Well, all those laws and all those institutions even are somehow, all those institutions embody some aspects of human rights. And the struggle for human rights has also paved the way to some very historic moments, such as the Glorious Revolution in England, such as the French Revolution, and even the formation of the UN has come due to this necessity to codify human rights in human society. But in this common thread, in this common struggle across the world to find, codify human rights, we have found that institutions, states have always been a bit lacking. And as a result, we have independent human rights defenders who have taken up the mantle to try and fight for human rights. Today, the conversation will be around the human rights defenders. Of course, thank you for Sain for introducing our distinguished panels. I'd like to begin by asking Madam Huma about a very important question that first needs to be set as a key principle. What is a human rights defender?
Thank you, and good morning. Those who are sitting behind you may wish to occupy the front chairs. A human rights defender, as per the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, it says people who protect and defend the rights alone or with other people of any specific group, community, any specific right. So that means that anybody who is working at any point for defending rights of himself or herself, as well as of others, alone or in collaboration with other people, is a human rights defender. This is a very different definition from what most of us kind of perceive as human rights defender. So a lot of our people are political activists, a lot of people who are not associated with any NGOs can be human rights defenders. And people can be human rights defenders at one point and may not be a human rights defender. One condition is that the person should embrace the idea of human rights as a whole and not be against other groups' human rights while promoting one specific group's human rights. It's difficult to know, it's difficult to define, but that's the definition. So, not to be actively at least promoting against any other group's human rights. In that sense, the declaration says that the aspiration is that everybody should be a human rights defender. Every citizen, every person, every human being should be a human rights defender. That's the only way to advance the agenda of human rights. I think this is good to start with.
Yes, that's an excellent first principle for human rights. And as I understand, this broad definition of human rights defenders is very fluid. And we see the element of politics here as well. As Ms. Huma mentioned, political activists can also sometimes count as human rights defenders, but perhaps not all the time. Regardless, all human rights defenders have historically faced multiple avenues of challenges, whether that be state repression, whether that be being persecuted by vested interest groups or people in power. Human rights defenders find themselves very small and sometimes very invisible, and as a result, they feel persecuted. I would like to ask the question of Rani Yenin. What are some of the key challenges that you yourself, as a human rights defender, have faced and in your work, and how can we overcome those challenges in your practical experience?
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for the question. It's a really big question. I'll just try to set the context a little bit about indigenous peoples' human rights defenders. And I feel the urge to do so because indigenous peoples' rights defenders, they are so invisible in national setting or even in international settings. I have to take this opportunity to talk about indigenous peoples' human rights defenders, and they are no different to human rights defenders. They are the defenders who are trying to defend indigenous peoples as a community, their right to land and all other human rights that will ensure that their community's right will be upheld. So indigenous peoples' human rights defenders who are working on the field at grassroots level or any other regional level and international level, they are facing lots of challenges. And I'm not going to talk about the challenges that I have faced, but I'm going to talk about the challenges that indigenous peoples in general, indigenous peoples' human rights defenders in general, they face. So the criminalization of indigenous peoples, that's quite rampant. So I don't know whether you know the definition of criminalization of human rights defenders. So using legislative means or justice system to penalize indigenous peoples in their legitimate demands and non-violent social protests. So if I look into Bangladesh, we have indigenous peoples in Chittagong Hill Tracts region, and also we have indigenous peoples in the plainlands. So when we meet with indigenous people right defenders in the plainland, as a joke, we ask them, him or her, we would ask that, how many cases have you gathered in your life? And if that person says 2 or 3, we'll be like, we would joke and would say, okay, so you are not doing right. You are not a great human rights defender, because the indigenous right defenders in the plainland, they would accumulate 20, 15, 20, 25 trumped up charges, false cases against their name. And that's one of the ways that vested interest groups, sometimes they're patroned by the state, and sometimes they are just interest groups that has connection with the government. They would just lodge those cases to financially drain those right defenders. And of course, that mental strain is there. So it can be very debilitating for those right defenders, because they have to use all their time to go to the court and attend those hearings. And of course, you have to pay for the lawyers and all those things. So that's one of the ways those vested interest groups or state ensures that that person who's very vocal, who's trying to defend the rights, is always occupied with something that that person has never done. That's one of the things I wanted to mention about. And also how media is used, especially right defenders, indigenous right defenders, most of the times, they're persecuted by the state, state agencies. And if security forces are engaged in that, then it becomes more harrowing for indigenous rights defenders. So why do we right defenders talk about media freedom? We talk about media freedom because media can be used to desensitize about indigenous peoples in general, and then indigenous rights defenders. So even in Bangladesh, it happens that media is used to spread the narrative is that indigenous peoples, they're wild and savage. Very crudely sometimes. Another thing is that indigenous peoples are separatists. Indigenous peoples, they're terrorists. So think about it. If you are constantly exposed to that narrative, then if something happens to one indigenous right defender, then you are desensitized already. There won't be a public outcry that this person's human rights been violated, this person's been killed, or this person has been taken to jail or been persecuted. And that is how state mechanisms can work to desensitize people about indigenous peoples. So I know we'll be talking more about the ways, the practical solutions we can counter these narratives. We can find solutions to support the defenders, and also I would encourage you to ask questions if you have some questions. I should have said that before I started to talk, because it's supposed to be a conversation style. It is called Bay of Bengal conversation, so I hope to have a conversation.
Of course. Thank you. Some very, very poignant points, I would say, about the desensitization of the abuse of human rights defenders. Dr. D'Souza, you have worked in conflict theaters across the world, particularly in Afghanistan. Do you see any parallels between the kind of abuse of human rights defenders that Rani Yanyan has stated in your experience as well abroad?
Well, I think the speakers, both Ms. Huma and Yanyan, have rightly pointed out to the issue of one is the approach to human rights. As stated in the Declaration, human rights is every citizen's responsibility to protect, to defend. So you don't need really defenders in that sense, if you have informed citizens today. The second is also about the criminalization which occurs and the labeling which occurs. Now, if you look at the conflict theaters, I did some work, spent some time in Afghanistan doing a lot of work there. And in the last 2 decades, you did see that there was a lot of freedom and a lot of women who were empowered at various levels, taking up issues of rights of women, and there was some attempt of codifying them and implementing them. But that was not a perfect system. So what you hear about Afghanistan today with the takeover by the Taliban is a very totalitarian regime which doesn't let human rights defenders take up issues. But you still see images of women in streets of Kabul protesting. And you also see women going about doing their business and business as usual with the Taliban. So I think there is a disconnect of understanding of what's really happening in the ongoing conflict theaters like Afghanistan, is a lack of understanding of the regime. And most of us think that if you are in a democratic setup, it's a perfect setup that you don't need to talk about human rights. Democracy itself doesn't ensure human rights at various levels. So, you need to understand why certain countries go through cycles of conflict or are prone to conflict. It's those issues, those grievances, those needs of the people which have not been addressed, which become the drivers for conflict. So Afghanistan was one classic case, but we also see that in South Asia, that various grievances come out at various levels. There is a tension between the citizen and the state will not be able to address that. Then you go through these moments as Bangladesh has witnessed and other countries in South Asia are witnessing. So for me to understand the role of a defender, just by labeling somebody as defender and putting them on the pedestal and then that person getting targeted by the state, it is more important, I think, to move away from that prism of understanding how every citizen can take up the responsibility. Because ultimately you might have a lot of declarations on the international level. The UN might be saying a lot of things, but it's for the countries, for the national law, to actually see that the citizens are protected, their grievances are addressed, their needs are addressed. So the whole debate which goes on, between conflict, ongoing conflict and post-conflict scenarios. For instance, now Afghanistan is seen as a post-conflict scenario. I don't see it as post-conflict. I didn't see it in the last 2 decades where everyone in the West declared as post-conflict just because they got decimated the Taliban and were able to install some kind of a democratic regime, which was not perfect at all at various levels. So we have to be careful when you intervene in theaters where there is conflict or there are conditions where there is a transition that could occur, could change the ground situation dramatically. So we need to have a broader understanding of how to work on human rights issues, how to make that issue an enabling factor for the citizens and for the state to act upon. I think I'll stop here. But if there's more questions coming in, then we'll have more conversations on this. Thank you.
Of course, thank you so much. There's a very valid point you raised about institutions failing to deliver on the human rights promises as stated in the Declaration of Human Rights. I would like to ask a question to Ms. Huma. You have worked in the UN system in Bangladesh for a very long time. Do you see, maybe you can provide some, you have also worked in other countries as well in the various UN systems. What are the main challenges that the UN and the UN systems in these various countries and conflict areas are facing in trying to provide, protect human rights and also protect human rights defenders? Perhaps you can make a few statements regarding that.
Thank you. First of all, I don't think the UN is meant to or should be the one seen as protecting human rights defenders, because UN is a body made up of nation states. And when we adopted the declaration, all the member states that were present, voted in favor of having this declaration on human rights defenders. So UN's ability to implement lies with the member states, because UN by itself is nothing but is made up of member states. So when the governments, the member states make a commitment at an international fora, how do we get that translated at the national level? And that's where the challenge lies, because a lot of governments do make commitments at international level that they do not implement or do not intend to implement in their own countries. So talking about the challenges vis-a-vis human rights defenders in Bangladesh, I mean, all kinds of challenges that one can think of. Some were highlighted by the two other speakers, from enforced disappearances to imprisonment to criminalization to hate campaigns, completely destroying someone online with false allegations, NGO law that doesn't allow then organizations and individuals to receive resources, labeling activities that may be defending a political right as terror activities or separatist nationals against national security. All of these tools have been used in last years that I have seen Bangladesh. Obviously, Bangladesh went through a change in August, a massive change in August 2024, but it's very short time. So I am yet to see changes. I'm hopeful, and I hope that it moves in the right direction, because it took a lot of lives, and it was an uprising that was rooted in several of human rights issues. But for the moment, given the short period, I can't say that things have improved. As I said, I hope that they would. So these have been the challenges of Bangladeshi human rights defenders. I just wanted to underscore one thing here, that human rights is inherently a very political concept. Talking about rights of any group, community, individual is not a technical issue. It's not a legal issue. The technical part and the legal part are only tools. The issue is a political one. And therefore, when the states choose to label certain political issues as against the state, and then they can put them as in the bracket of terror or in the bracket of national security, and therefore those issues should not be raised, it makes it very difficult for human rights defenders, and also for those who work with human rights defenders like myself, to justify and to find legitimate avenues and spaces, because we regularly receive very hostile submissions from the government saying that we, as the UN, are supporting dissidents and separatists and people who are terrorists. Now the new terminology is terrorist for the last 20 years or so. So these are not specific to Bangladesh challenges, but they do exist in Bangladesh too. And every place where I have served, I have seen this type of challenges. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Now, I would like to open the floor up to the audience. Of course, I see hands raising up.
Thank you. I'm Ho Chi Minh. I do work for transgender rights. I have two questions. I think as someone who has faced significant challenges while advocating for transgender rights in Bangladesh, I often find myself questioning the global mechanisms for protection, given the rising threats against human rights defenders, particularly those working for gender and sexual minorities. How can international organizations and governments ensure the local advocates have both the immediate safety nets and the long-term institutional support to continue their work without fear of persecution? Furthermore, how can we foster a global alliance that amplifies marginalized voices without imposing external agendas that might not align with the local context? And one thing I also want to add, when we step forward and protest, there is always the backlash. With endless justification and excuse for inaction, all we want is to live our lives in our own way without fear. But the complexity of diplomacy and the international agencies meant to protect defenders often feels like they are not responding appropriately. it's almost as if they are blind to the real situation on the ground. How much brutality do we as transgender and Hijra individuals need to endure before the international community will finally step in? It's terrifying when the UN Human Rights Commissioners comes to fact check. Do they really listen to the voice of these super marginalized communities? And I'm not just referring to the broader LGBT movement. There is micropolitics, elitism, and class and caste struggle within the activism itself. My focus is on the transgender and Hijra communities who are often left unheard and unprotected. And one single question to Rani Yanyan. You met with the chief advisor alongside various women's movement activists and NGO representatives and other stakeholders. Did you feel that the voices of transgender people are missing from that table? If so, how do you view this lack of inclusion? And what steps do you think should be taken to ensure that such discussion truly represents all marginalized communities, including transgender individuals?
Thank you for your question. I believe it would be best if we try to just ask the question and then say to which of the panelists the question is for. The gentleman over, please.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Jahidul Islam. I'm a teacher. My question is to Rani Yanian. So basically, rights also includes right to identity. So Bangladesh is going to through some transition right now, and there is a huge discussion going on regarding constitutional reformation. So are you thinking of inclusion of pluralist identity in the constitution as your ethnic identity as well as your linguistic identity? And are you making any sort of advocacy, especially when this is a very crucial phase is going on, because people and from the government side as well as advocate side are working on the issues. So I think this is very high time to make a very strong voice in the society to include all the identities as well as linguistic perspective.
Thank you for your question. I believe both of them were directed to Rani Yenyan. We will come back to another round of questions, but for now, I believe we can begin the answers.
Thank you for the question. So constitutional reform and the reform commissions. Let's not only talk about constitutional reform commission. Let's talk about all the committees that's been formed by the interim government. So we do not have. We always have expected that since the regime has changed, now we will have more inclusion in the decision-making process, especially when the country is going through this transition and we are looking for reform in the system. And that is the commitment of interim government. So we expected that in these commissions, we will have equitable representation. I wouldn't say equal, equitable representation. But it's been disheartening to see that we don't have women's voices. We don't have voices from minority and marginalized community, be that ethnic minority, be that religious minority, be that sexual minority communities. And we have been trying to advocate for inclusion. But so far, it hasn't been heard by the government. But at the same time, I understand that most of the time, what we advocate for is not going to be taken up by the institution or by those people who are in power. But we have to keep on, we have to continue to talk about all these issues. You have to lobby different members. There are different members in the commission. And if you are part of a network that has good connections with, even at individual level, you just have to make the most of it. We have not actually stopped talking about it, and few of the representatives, indigenous representatives and also minority representatives, they have been meeting up with different members of Constitutional Reform Commission. So if our representation is not ensured in those commissions, we will try to ensure that our voices are heard through the members of this commission. So there's still hope.
Perhaps the second question as well?
Yes.
But perhaps...
But she asked two questions, and one question is directed towards me. So I'm going to answer that question. When I got the chance to meet with Chief Advisor, it wasn't that, yes, I received that invitation and I went in. I didn't actually expect that I would be invited. So I went in there, and so many only women rights activists there. And we only got like a minute or two to talk about. So yes, inclusion is a big problem, as I said. Even in the commissions that are going to take decisions for the future of our nation. But in a good note, we talked about inclusion of everyone, and I can vividly remember that we were 26 or 27 of us were there, and at least 8 of us talked about inclusion of every minority and marginalized community, every community that are invisible. That's all we could do.
Thank you. To build on those questions a little bit, but very quickly, I would like to ask Dr. D'Souza that this invisibility of human rights defenders and this kind of absence of representation, particularly from minority communities, I'm sure you have seen this play out in many contexts, in many places where you worked. But have you ever encountered a positive example of a place where such action was taken to include people, to include minority communities in the human rights conversation as well?
Well, I think that's been a difficult proposition for most of the countries. But if you look at very local level achievements, particularly, I can talk about a case in Northeast India, where in a state in Mizoram in 80s, there was an insurgency. And the state used a lot of force to crush that. But it also provided a space for political representation. So once the conflict was ended, this group, the Mizo Liberation Front, came as a political group, contested elections, and won the elections. So this is seen as one of the success, where you give that platform, give an opportunity for those who are fighting for the indigenous rights and for the representation to be a part of a system and to have their own rights over their land. So I think that was one case. But if you look at other cases like in Nagaland, which I see it as a negative piece at some level because that conflict has been ongoing. Now, most of the studies in terms of conflict go by the indicators of levels of violence. Just because the levels of violence have decreased, and here again I would say Afghanistan, that doesn't mean the conflict has ended. The drivers of the conflict still exist. So if they exist and we are not addressing them, and we are just the state or rest of the country is happy with just a scenario where there's no killings and no violence, but what about the other conditions which are leading the youth to join those groups or to perpetuate the conflict? Then I think we have problems by not including. So for me, it's like one is at international level, which I think Huma talked about at UN, but I think it's very broad-based. It comes down to the national. Now, again, inside the national level, like for a country like India or Afghanistan or most of the South Asian countries, it is the local systems which work. And most of the time, I find that local systems are not able to address those issues because either they're disconnected with the center or they don't have mechanisms, or more importantly, those who are involved are corrupt at various levels. So for me, having informed citizenry, awareness among citizens is more important than looking at just, framing laws after laws or trying to defend the defender, where everyone should be defending for their own rights and the state has to protect the rights. So if the citizens are aware and use it as a political tool during elections, that they want this issue to be addressed, just not maybe on case of minorities, but more in case of your economic rights, your social rights, your political rights. And that, I think, gives a wide canvas for politicians at a local level to take up this issue and truly represent the rights of the people. Because beyond that, it looks difficult for me, for the center sitting very distant from what's happening, say, in Northeast India or in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or any of these countries, to address the issues. So we need a very decentralized local approach to dealing with human rights. And that actually represents the rights of the people. So I think I'll rest it there, and if there are more questions, I'll take that.
Of course. And Dr. D'Souza mentioned a very important point about local communities and local communities being very active, or needing local communities to be very active in order to actually provide human rights defenders the support systems required for them to function. In this thread, I would like to ask Ms. Huma a very important question. How do we bring human rights home? Human rights has always been in the hall. It's being discussed in the halls of, in the UN. It's being discussed by foreign powers as talking points. But how can we bring human rights into the culture, into the conversation that's happening at the local level here in Bangladesh?
Thank you. Before I get into that, there was a question about the protection, and I think we should be addressing that. I do feel that when we take up human rights issues, there is no protection system. So we take a genuine risk, and that has to be a calculated risk, because we cannot put that frustration on others for not protecting. So that's the first thing of how do we take calculated risks? Because one thing that I have seen has emerged as a human rights protection mechanism is that I should be allowed to go and live in a Western country and should be funded to do that. And I do want to say that this is not really helpful protection, building on, because we create generation and a group of people who are unhappy then, because they feel they've not been allowed to go so-and-so went and got asylum in US and France. And this is not something that is focused on providing asylum in Western countries. The local systems, the local communities, and it's everyone's job to protect, not only any one entity or institution, because nobody can. Now, on the issue of bringing human rights home, I always look at African nations, because after the Universal Declaration was adopted, and which was very Western-led, let's accept it, it was during the colonial period, where the voices from the rest of the world were very limited. But then African continent made an effort to have the African Charter for Human Rights, where they set up their own systems. They defined, building on the Universal Declaration, but what suited their culture and context. While in this part of the world, in South Asia, we always find our governments and many others in our society saying, oh, this is a Western concept. But this is just a concept. It doesn't have any tag to it, and it's for us to make it conducive to what works in our context, rather than rejecting the whole idea of human rights just because it's Western. It's our role to redefine it in our own contexts and bring it home. So make it our own.
Thank you. That's a beautiful point. I would like to open it up to the audience once more.
Yeah, lots of questions. Thank you. I'll try to be very, very quick. Thank you so much. I represent the international development community, and every morning I wake up seeing Twitter, and there's just a chill in the air, right? It's just like the international community is not going to be able to do the little that they did in the past. We need it. And with that, I just not to be negative, but just to say how important and how much I appreciate your contribution. The question I had was really when Huma was talking also to question speaker, like there's also things the international community should perhaps not do, and perhaps you can say a little bit about that, time allowing, of course. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We'll take one more question.
I'm Tawid Asandhua. I'm working as a human rights project coordinator at Right to Freedom. My question is on enforced disappearance in Bangladesh. Enforced disappearances remain a crucial human rights issue in Bangladesh, with numerous cases involving activists, journalists, and political opponents. What accountable measures can international human rights organizations and UN mechanisms take to address this issue, ensuring accountability and justice for victims and their families? Thank you.
Who is the question for?
I would like to ask Huma Khan ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Tasneem and I work for Bangladesh Youth Leadership Center. So my question is to Dr. D'Souza that are you afraid that democracy is turning into a game of popularity and it poses risk of more marginalizing the marginalized communities?
Hello, I'm Naurin Sultana, studying mass communication and journalism in University of Dhaka. So my question is, authoritarian regimes often use the strategy to divide people. In last 15 years and before that, we have seen intentional polarization in Bangladesh, and the defenders are criminalized. Even the sufferers take human rights defenders as enemy or elitist. In this process of othering process, we see a spiral of silence among people when it comes to defending other people outside of their bubble. So how to be more connected to those people and break the spiral of silence? Thank you.
Thank you. Is the question directed at any panelists in particular?
Rani and ma'am.
Okay. So 2 questions for Huma and 1 question each for the other 2 panelists, please.
Thank you. I think one thing I fully agree that as part of international community, we need to do a lot of unlearning ourselves. And some of the things that we have done have not actually helped in terms of defending human rights defenders or several other issues. So I think it's useful for us to also reflect and unlearn and build local capacities as opposed to offering things that look very, very glamorous, but they're not a sustainable solution. And we all have been part of that, and that's why we see there is this almost frustration that why is it not coming to me? So I think we need to respect the local systems and cultures first, and then try to build what mechanisms we want to build to protect people rather than bringing our standards, which often come from only one part of the world, and start imposing them and those solutions to the other parts of the world. I fully agree with that. And on the issue of enforced disappearances, it's interesting that we 3 have spoken a lot about local solutions, but you want an international solution to something. It's your government who signed up to the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. So international mechanisms are not, let's not confuse, they are made up of the same government. So Bangladesh is represented by the government of Bangladesh in the United Nations system. And when the system adopts something and the government of Bangladesh signs on to that, to implement that is the responsibility of the government of Bangladesh and not of the international community. So there is a working group on enforced disappearances, but their main role is to help people find their family members. Once the person is found, the case gets closed because they're not a justice delivery mechanism. If you read the convention, that is the responsibility of government of Bangladesh. And we should start putting focus where it lies. Not to just find few Western governments who would listen to you, or some people like me who listen. We don't have any authority to deliver justice. Let's not get confused. Only entity that can deliver justice here is the government of Bangladesh and institutions of Bangladesh. Unless there is an issue taken up to ICC, International Criminal Court, which has a lot of requirements which your country does not fulfill. So the justice mechanism in Bangladesh should act on that. Thank you.
Can I just add on?
Of course.
Just for a minute about these international instruments and mechanisms. Just because Bangladesh government has signed a document, it doesn't mean that Bangladesh government will be committed to do it. And as right defenders, it is our duty to keep on talking about it, to hold the government accountable, that these declarations and these commitments, these commitments should be met by the government. So right defenders, when we work in the field, we can get elated, like when Bangladesh government signs this document or this instrument, international instrument. But that is not the end of right defenders' journey. That is another chapter of the journey to make the government accountable if it does not carry out the commitment that it has promised.
And I believe you also had a question directed at you, at Rani.
I think it's about the understanding of the way democracies work. As Huma rightly pointed out, human rights is seen as a Western approach. Most of the traditional societies in Asia, democracy is alien to many of them. So just because you have a democracy doesn't mean it's perfect. There are a lot of local characteristics which are fed into it, which I think the Western world or even the international organizations don't understand. So to understand how it works, I think we need to get down to a very local level and build in those local capacities and provide platforms. So what democracy has done at one level is to give those avenues, right? You have systems like elections, representation, accountability, which democracies expect. So if you look at how democracies have evolved in Asia and the way they are moving on the scale of, when you see a rise of populist movements, you see that in Europe, you see that in US. So what does democracy mean to you? It's ultimately about your system, which is in sync with the needs of the people. So I think we need to understand democracy in that light and have the local representation, the local needs, the local aspirations being met. And for me, as I mentioned before, I think it's just not about the regimes, it's about political representation and mobilization of the people. So if you have someone defending human rights issues and is been labeled out, singled out, criminalized, and is targeted by the state, what are the rest of the people doing? I mean, if the person is taking up an issue which matters to a significant section of the population, it is the responsibility of the people to work with that person so that the person is not targeted and at times even eliminated. We just watch everything occur just because that person is labeled as a human rights defender or a terrorist or someone who has taken up issues which don't matter to you, but in the long term they might. So as students, as citizens, as responsible citizens of a country, I think all of you should take up that role. And that's when human rights will not be like segregated or elevated to a state where you can't act upon. So we have to build those channels of communications, those linkages with people who are working on issues which matter, and thereafter take it to another level rather than just expecting, say, even on transgender, that someone on the global level will act. It doesn't happen that way. So we have to have a very local approach, and we have to have an understanding of what happens on the ground. And most of the time, even if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, the intervention didn't work because no one understands local customs and the needs. And even today, if they want to be where they are in their cultural and societal space, I think countries shouldn't intervene. We need to respect what the people want, and we have to ensure that people get the platforms and the access to do what they want to do, because that is what is aspirational. And democracies, I think, is one way. It's about working in a democratic system to make it better. But democracy is not an answer to all your problems. Okay?
Thank you. Excellent answer. We are running very behind schedule, so I would like to wrap up in the shortest possible way. How do we defend defenders? Perhaps from the grassroots, not from the top up, and perhaps not from far away. So I believe with that, we will end our panel here. Thank you very much to all our speakers. Perhaps we can have a round of applause. And thank you for being here.